Good morning. Boker Tov. Today is Thursday, December 19th. This is going to be our last shiur for a while. Certainly our last one in the calendar year 2025, right before Hanukkah. We are studying Gemara and related texts on the Jewish life cycle. We had a briefest of introductions to conversion last week, so that's exactly where we're going to pick up this week as soon as we say the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So last week we were introduced to two biblical references to a figure known in Hebrew as the ger, gimoresh, gioret in the feminine. The ger is translated in various ways, most often as the stranger or the stranger sojourner or the sojourner resident. It's clearly a person who had a kind of mixed status of both being in the community and not of the community. So this is a person who is not a native Israelite, but who makes company or creates an association by living among the Israelite people. And many times the ger is referenced throughout the Torah. We looked at passages from Leviticus chapter 19 and Exodus chapter 20, both of which make clear that the ger is to be treated more like the Israelites than like an outsider or a foreigner. And most importantly, the Torah repeats itself many times when it says that the ger is not to be mistreated. Some verses go beyond that to suggest that the ger really has a status equivalent to that of a native-born Israelite. So that's what we looked at, but I wanted to emphasize at the same time that even though the Torah makes reference to this ger, the insider outsider, the one who is in the community but not of the community, the Torah does not have a standard that is, I think, correctly identified as conversion. So the Torah doesn't provide for a norm or a process by which a person who is from outside the Israelite community can become a native-born Israelite or to attain the same status as an Israelite who is born to the Israelite community, um, namely something like conversion. That doesn't really exist in the Torah. But wait, you say, I've heard about Ruth. Wasn't Ruth the original convert? And that's what we're going to pick up today. Because if you have a bell ringing that somewhere in the Jewish tradition we look to Ruth as paradigmatic of the conversion process and norms, you are correct. We do. But what we want to do is actually look at who Ruth was and what Ruth did before we examine two passages about Ruth from the rabbinic literature. We're going to look at a passage from the Midrash on Ruth, which is called Ruth Rabbah, which means the great collection on the book of Ruth. And then we're going to look at Babylonian Talmud, tractate Yevamot, uh, page 47 A and B. Once again, let's take a look at the book of Ruth itself. Right at the beginning, we'll do a little bit of reading, mostly in the English until it comes time to look at the Hebrew. So the book of Ruth is a Megillah. It is a scroll of writing, and therefore is included in the section of the Tanakh from which the the final chaf of Tanakh is taken, which stands for Ketuvim. The Ketuvim or the Ketuvim are the writings from the Hebrew word kotev, which means to write. So the Bible, you may know, this is a refresher, is composed of three component parts: Torah, prophets, and writings. Tanakh, or Torah, Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. Tanakh, put it together, it's an acronym. So this is from the Ketuvim. What else is in the Ketuvim that we're familiar with? Lots of stuff. The book of Ecclesiastes and Esther and First and Second Chronicles and Proverbs and Psalms are all from the chaf part, for the Ketuvim. Prophets, of course, are folks like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets, Amos, Hosea, and so forth. Um, so this is Ruth, one of the writings and also one of the scrolls that are read on Jewish festivals. So you may know that we read Kohelet or the Book of Ecclesiastes on Sukkot. Ruth is the scroll that is read on Shavuot, on the festival of receiving the law at Sinai, which also corresponds to the barley harvest, which is the time of year in which the book of Ruth is set. Finally, just on this, other writings associated with holidays include Megillat Esther, which of course is read on Purim, and I'm trying to think of other scrolls that we read. It'll come to me. Okay, let's take a look. Vayehi bimei shvot hashoftim. It was in the days when the chieftains ruled, or the judges. But don't think like legal officials wearing robes and handing down laws. Judges in the Hebrew sense, these are like warlords, or chieftains is a good translation. There was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah, with his wife and two sons, went to reside in the country of Moab. So there's a famine in Eretz Yisrael. On account of that, this family seeks refuge in neighboring Moab, which is in present-day northern Jordan. So it's on Israel's eastern border. And reading on, the man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Noomi or Naomi. And his two sons were named Machlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Let's just unpack this. So the person we're talking about is Elimelech. He's married to Naomi, and they have two sons named Machlon and Chilion, which are actually intentionally funny names, not funny haha, but they're leading names. Machlon means disease, and Chilion means misfortune. So these are not, we know right away, even without knowing anything about these two boys, that they're not going to have a happy ending. So Machlon and Chilion, disease and misfortune. Ephratites, so they're from Ephrat, which is the province or region, it says of Bethlehem. So the whole area, this is like Jerusalem suburbs today, southern Jerusalem suburbs in the territory of Judah, the tribe of Judah, and they flee by going northeast and come to the country of Moab and remain there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she's left alone with her two sons, Machlon and Chilion. They married Moabite women because, of course, they're living in Moab. One is named not Oprah, don't read it too fast, it's Orpah, and the other is Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And then those two, Machlon and Chilion, also died. Well, I told you, you know that's going to happen. So the woman was left without her two sons and without her husband. So this is really in 5 verses, Naomi's had a very hard life. She's been widowed and has lost her two children. She started out with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for in the country of Moab she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and given them food. So they're saying the reason she had been there in the first place was that there was food, whereas there was a famine in Eretz Yisrael. Um, but now it's time to go home. And she's there with her daughters-in-law. And it says, accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, turn back, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. In other words, you've been wonderful family members, but it's time to part ways. I could not possibly expect you to make this journey back to what for you would be a foreign land, right? You've never left Moab. I don't expect you to come with me. May the Lord grant that you each find security in the house of a husband. So in other words, I'm sorry that you're both widows as well. I know what it's like. Go and, be fruitful and multiply. And she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi replied, turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? I've got nothing to offer you. Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you, on their account, debar yourselves from marriage? In other words, you're young, fertile, attractive women. Don't saddle yourself with this burden of following me back to Judah. Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me. They broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell. All right, so Orpah stays in Moab, but Ruth clung to her. Hebrew, Verut davkabah. So she cleaved or clung to her mother-in-law. Which, by the way, in Kabbalistic thought, this word davka is a word that often implies the optimal relationship between the person and God. So this isn't just physical clinging, this also implies spiritual dedication. What a person wants most in life is to cleave to God. Okay, moving on. Vatomer, hine shava yivimtech. She said, see, your sister-in-law has already returned to her people and her gods. Go and follow your sister-in-law. In other words, you don't really, Ruth. It's very nice, but please don't come with me. But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. And this, of course, is the most famous line. Ki el asher teilchi elech, for wherever you go, I will go. Uva asher talini alin, wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Amech ami, your people are my people or will be my people. Velohayich Elohai, and your God is my God. And it continues this beautiful and celebrated monologue of Ruth. Ba'asher tamuti amut, wherever you die, I shall die. Vesham ekaber, there I will be buried. Ko ya'aseh Adonai v'cho yosif, thus and more may God do to me. Ki hamavet yafrid beini uveinech, if anything but death parts me from you. And then, of course, the conclusion of the passage, when Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her, and the two went on until they reached Bethlehem. And then the story unfolds from there. So the story of Ruth following her mother-in-law is important in the Jewish understanding of this text and the Jewish understanding of Ruth as the paradigmatic convert to Judaism. So what is said in this passage and what is not said? First of all, the word ger, the one word we have that is associated with conversion in Judaism, is not mentioned. The status of ger is not ascribed to any of the characters in this story. Also, there is no word for conversion, and there is no understanding that what Ruth is doing is changing religions, except for the line that says, your God will be my God. So there's this beautiful monologue that Ruth offers. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Where you die, I shall be buried, and so forth. That's what Ruth actually says. But Ruth does not say, I want to be an Israelite or I want to be a Jew just like you, except she kind of does say that. But there's also no process identified. Like the story unfolds from here, and Ruth eventually meets a caring man named Boaz, who is an Israelite, and falls in love with him, and is accepted in the Israelite community. So the unfolding of the story is dispositive of the fact that, at least for the community that wrote or understood this story in the time it was promulgated, had in the story an example of a person who was a foreigner who not only came into an Israelite family but was accepted and even found an Israelite husband and was accepted. And then if you look at the very last chapter of the book of Ruth, as if to underscore this point, oops, I accidentally closed it, so hang on for a second. I'm going to bring it back up on the screen. So where is Ruth? Ruth, where are you? Nehemiah, Targum, Esther, Song of Songs, Prom. Huh, hang on for a second. It must be here. Oh, Ruth. Yes, a Moabite widow. So if you go to the very, very end of the book, um, I'll pick up chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife, and he cohabited with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. And the woman said to Naomi, her mother-in-law, Blessed be the Lord, who has not withheld a redeemer from you today. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain your old age, for he is born of your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than seven sons. Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom. She became its foster mother. And the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, A son is born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Yishai or Jesse, who was the father of David. So very important. What we are to learn from this is that Ruth is King David's grandmother. And so if we accept that David is a legitimate Jew through and through, a paradigmatic figure for the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition, it therefore stands to reason that we should accept his grandmother as his legitimate ancestor and as Jewish as anyone who was born into the tribe. Right? That's the point. And then, of course, it goes through this genealogical coda where they trace the line of Peretz, who was born to Judah. So Peretz is the offspring of Judah and Tamar. Actually, the story of Judah and Tamar is told in this week's Torah portion, Vayeshev, the one we're reading right now in late December. Peretz begot Hezron, Ram, Aminadav, Nachshon begot, that's not Salmon, it's Shalma. I don't know why they call him Salmon in English. Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. So the patrilineal line of descent goes all the way back to the original offspring of Judah, the namesake of the tribe, who is a son of Jacob. So they're saying you have X number of generations, it's probably either seven or 10, from Jacob to David. But what's fascinating is interposed in there, two generations before King David, is a convert to Judaism. Right? So now we want to look at how the rabbis actually take the character of Ruth and use her to make their point about what is conversion and how we convert. All right, so any questions just on the root text from Tanakh that we're looking at? Great. Familiar with the story. I imagine at some point you've heard that Shavuot is the time when we read Ruth, and that Ruth is a story about a woman who converted to Judaism. But I have to keep putting finger quotes around it because I'm not persuaded that the biblical authors understood what Ruth was doing as converting. Okay. So let's take a peek at our next text. So what I'd like to do is bring up onto the screen a midrash first. So we're going to do a little midrash, which will just set us up for the rabbinic, for the harder stuff, which of course is Gemara. Um, Midrash tends to be more approachable than Gemara. Gemara is like the deepest end of the deep pool. All right. Vatomer Ruth Al tifki'ivi le'ozvech lashuv me'acharayich. So this is Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth said, do not force me or impose on me or entreat me to leave you or to return from following you. And then it goes on to, of course, the famous lines, For wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. So that's the verse that the Midrash is going to take up in its Midrashic weaving of narrative around the biblical story. Mahu al tifkivi. What is this business about do not entreat me to leave? And let's go on. Ruth said, Do not entreat me to leave you, to return from following you. What do we mean, do not entreat me? She said to her, Do not sin to me, do not impose your reservations upon me. So this is Ruth saying back to Naomi, do not, whatever you're carrying, whatever baggage you have, that's not mine. To leave you, to return from following you. Ruth is saying, so what the rabbis are doing, they're constructing or inventing a dialogue, an in between the lines dialogue between Ruth and Naomi. They're basically saying, okay, um, here's what really went down between Ruth and Naomi. Here's the the context and the fine detail of their conversation. I often say if you want to understand Midrash, pretend that you've been handed a biblical text by a big Hollywood studio, and you've just been hired to direct the movie of, in this case, the Book of Ruth. How do you want to film this dialogue? In other words, how do you want to portray the characters of Naomi and Ruth so that you understand more deeply their motivations? Because biblical text is really laconic. It doesn't say much, or more to my point, it says much without many words. So the biblical text doesn't use a lot of words to convey a lot of meaning, and often that's where Midrash entertains the idea that, well, maybe there's stuff, as it were, between the lines that we can look at. So according to the invented dialogue that the rabbis provide around this famous narrative in Ruth, in any case, Ruth is saying to her mother-in-law, my intention is to convert. It is preferable through you and not through another. In other words, if I'm going to join the Israelites, I already have a relationship with you. You are my mother-in-law. I was married to your son. My life is bound up with yours. So if I already want to convert for my own reasons, why not let you be my guide? Okay. When Naomi heard this, she began arranging the laws of converts for her. So here we have, because of course Ruth says, I want to convert, but what the rabbis are inventing here in this narrative, they're inventing this idea that, well, wait a minute, Ruth was the first, so there were no laws for converts. There were no rules yet. So when Ruth said, hey, Naomi, I intend to become an Israelite or a Jew, though that word is not used here, but they are going back to Judah, which is the original tribe from which the name of our people, Jew, is, of course, derived. Jew and Judah, it's the exact same word in Hebrew. Yehuda, Yehudi. Um, Ruth is Ruth is saying, "Hey, I want to convert," and Naomi has a job now. She's like, "Well, I got to come up with how you do that. There's no process." So when Naomi heard this, she began arranging the laws of converts for her. Naomi said to Ruth, my daughter, it is not the way of Israelite women to go to theaters and the circuses of Gentiles. So that's the first rule. The first rule is that if you want to be an Israelite, you got to behave like an Israelite. And here are some things we don't do. It is unseemly for Jewish women to hang out in the circuses and the theaters. Now, what's going on here? My guess is that this is a rabbinic superimposition of their own associations with Gentile culture, predominantly Roman, right? On, let's say, the substrate of the text itself from the Bible, which are the Moabites. The rabbis are writing from a time and place where there is no such thing as Moabite civilization anymore. It had long fallen into the dust of history. And so when the rabbis want to talk about, well, what do we think about Gentile culture? What comes to mind? The rabbis don't need to reach very far. They're living in a massive sea of Gentile culture. The rabbis were living and writing in the predominant, imperial culture of the time, which was the Empire of Rome. So they're saying um, this is just not something that Jews do. I'm trying to think where it says Kevan sheshama Naomi. Okay, so lelech lebate teatrot. So this is the word for theaters. It's exactly what you think it is. It's a loan word from Latin, teatrot, or Greek, I think, theater. Ulevate kirkasiot, circuses. So this is what Jews don't do. Shel goyim, right? Of the goyim. So I've just highlighted the words that I want you to see on the screen. It is not seemly for Jews to hang out in theaters. I won't tell Kelly, and the circuses of the goyim. And Ruth responded, and here's what the rabbis have done. They're like weaving together their invented dialogue with the actual dialogue of the story. It's really literarily, from a literary standpoint, it's quite ingenious. And so they have Ruth respond with her famous words, wherever you go, I will go. So Naomi says, hey, this is not something that Jews do. And Ruth is like, I get it. I'm going to follow where you go. So if you say we have to go to shul instead of the circus, I'm with you. Naomi said, My daughter, it is not the way of Israel, meaning the Israelites or the Jewish people, to reside in a house where there is no mezuzah. Again, why are these the things that come to mind first for Naomi? I don't know. She's making it up on the spot, right? I mean, that's the conceit of this midrash is that Naomi hears that her daughter-in-law wants to convert, and she's like, "Oh, I guess I got to figure out how you convert." So, don't go to circuses, don't go to the theaters of the goyim, and put a mezuzah on your door. And Ruth said, "Where you lodge, I will lodge." In other words, of course I'll live in a house with a mezuzah because I'm going to live with you. And then finally, your people will be my people. These are punishments and prohibitions. Meaning, what does it mean to be part of a people? And the rabbis are explaining that as Naomi was presenting this to Ruth, what Naomi was responsible for doing is saying, well, these are our ways, and the Jewish ways are law. So, what does it mean to be part of the Jewish people? It means that you agree to, you submit to our law and its punishments and prohibitions. So, in other words, you agree not to do all the things that Jews don't do, whether that's we don't eat non-kosher food, we don't, walk around uncircumcised, all of the things that Jews are prohibited from doing, Ruth is consenting to, and the penalties associated with them she's subjecting herself to. And then finally, your God is my God covers all the rest of the mitzvot. So it's not, and this is fascinating too. This is like one of a gazillion places where we can make the case that Judaism is a religion of deed before creed. When Ruth says, your God is my God, the rabbis don't say that means you have to profess belief in God. They say, no, what that means is you have to agree to all the other mitzvot. Like, what does it mean to take on peoplehood and God as a Jew, as a convert? It means basically that you agree to live a Jewish life, right? So the declaration that a convert makes, even today, is not really a declaration of faith. It's a declaration of dedication to a way of life. And that is true then as now. Okay, we have a couple hands. Let's take those. Mom and Dad, you've got the first hand.
It seems to me that Ruth is coming to this from a pagan or a polytheistic culture because Orpah is enjoined, go back to your gods. So Ruth's approach to this seems to me very much, what is this concept of monotheism?
Mhm.
Especially when she says, like, your God will be my God. Like, I'll take off the one from the mantelpiece that I've been, dedicating myself to, and I'll put your God up there instead. It's kind of a naive approach, I think, but in its own way, I think it's very charming.
Lovely. I think that's great. If you were the director of the movie of Ruth, and they actually did do like a TV miniseries. In fact, this is fascinating. Kelly and I were just sort of like channel surfing the other night. We both got home late from work. Kelly's doing a lot of gigs these days for holiday concerts and seasonal singing work, and I just work all the time. So I get home and it's late, and I'm like, oh my goodness, The Sound of Music is on. And so Kelly was in the national tour of The Sound of Music, which they are rebooting, by the way. And this was several years ago, like 8 years ago or so. And we're watching The Sound of Music, and we turn on just in time for Climb Every Mountain, which is the big Act One closer with the Mother Abbess singing Climb Every Mountain. And I'm like, she's extraordinary. Who is that? And we look her up, and of course, now I'm going to blank on her name. Peggy something played the Mother Abbess in the movie of The Sound of Music at the age of like 73, by the way. And we're like, boy, she's in fine voice, but apparently it was dubbed. In any case, here's what's interesting. So we look up this actress, and she was this very, very distinguished actress who had won, Oscars and Oscar nominated for this role. And then we found out that she played Naomi in like a movie of Ruth. I guess they made Ruth into a movie in the 50s or 60s or something like that. I'm gonna have to look it up. I was fascinated by this. In any case, yeah, if you're making the movie of Ruth, how do you want to portray the character of Ruth? And I like this idea that and I think it's consistent with the rabbis are saying, she's totally naive about Judaism. She knows nothing. She's simply saying, I cast my lot with you, And when I say my God, let's sub out our gods, and the word is the same for gods plural, Elohim, and God singular, Elohim. Elohim is one of those words that functions both as a plural and as a singular. So the rabbis may actually, Dad, be attuned to that irony of language where you can use the same word to mean plural gods or the one God that Israelites worship. In any case, I love this idea that, you're portraying Ruth as this naive country bumpkin who, because of her love for Naomi, says, no, 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 my desire is to be with you. Shai Held, my wonderful teacher and friend who lives around the corner from me and who wrote most recently a magnificent book called Judaism is About Love. It's a bit of a doorstop, so you're making a commitment if you pick it up to read it. But he does a beautiful read of Ruth, which is included in the book, I recall, where he says the overarching theme of the book of Ruth is chesed, that Ruth is above all a book about the paramount role of loving kindness, chesed, in the Jewish tradition. That Ruth's decision to follow Naomi is not about her belief in the Israelite God. It's about her chesed for her mother-in-law, and the love she feels. And this is how she expresses that love. I'm going to join my lot with yours. And Boaz accepts Ruth, even though she's a foreigner and a pagan, into his household by showing her chesed. So there's a lot in the book that like it's the through line that connects people and transcends cultural or religious differences. Arlene and then Steve, please.
Um, I was a little puzzled because, after all, Ruth was married to one of Naomi's sons. I don't know whether they were actively practicing any form of Judaism. So I'm really wondering about that. I would assume that there were simple little things that Ruth had already been exposed to. And the fact that Naomi is repeating some very simplistic things, like you can't go to the circus and the theater and you have to have a mezuzah on the door. So I don't know
Yeah.
that.
So by the way, I don't know either. I mean, again, unfortunately for Ruth and Orpah, her sister, no, her sister-in-law, unfortunately for the two young women, who you have to imagine are like barely out of adolescence or
Okay.
possibly still in adolescence, right? 13, 14, 15 years old, marrying age in biblical
Right.
time. Well, we know that Naomi's husband and then her two sons die in very quick succession, like in the matter of three verses. So how much life did Ruth have with
Okay.
her husband before he died
Passed away. Yeah.
is not known.
Right.
However, so there's some interesting other stuff one can observe from the book of Ruth is that both here and at the end of the story, it intimates without saying that matrilineal descent may actually be a thing in Judaism. Now, of course, we
Ah,
accept that. We are 21st century Jews. We've had a 2000 year plus tradition
yeah.
of Jewish identity or Jewish uh, status
Right.
being conveyed through the mother. But that is not the biblical norm. Consider, for instance, the character we're reading about in this week's Torah portion, who is Joseph, right? So this week and for the next 3 weeks, Joseph is the star of the biblical show. Um, so we're reading a long saga. It's one of the longest like units of biblical text is the Joseph story. It takes up, the better part of 13 full chapters of Torah. Joseph in Egyptian exile in the house of Potiphar and then in the Pharaoh's prison, once he is redeemed from prison by
Mm.
Pharaoh, becomes the vice regent to all of Egypt. Joseph marries Pharaoh's like own daughter.
Right.
So clearly Joseph had a non-Jewish spouse,
Right.
but no one doubts that Joseph's children are Jewish, so much so that he blesses them, as does Jacob, as heirs to the Israelite legacy.
Yeah.
So the Bible, and similarly Moses also marries a foreign woman, Zipporah.
Right.
She's a Midianite.
Yeah.
Later, Miriam and Aaron disparage her as a Cushite. Maybe that's a different wife. Either way, whether Moses had one or two or more wives, none of them was an Israelite. And it is prima facie assumed that all of Moses' children were, as it were, Jews. right? There's no
Mhm.
doubt that Moshe's line is a Jewish line. So it does invite some speculation about, well, what's going on with Ruth? Because the husbands, whether or not the husbands were observant Jews is almost immaterial. We know that by the end of the story, the fact that Ruth becomes David's grandmother means that she does not invalidate the line. So
Right.
either she's considered as an Israelite, or do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
thanks, Arlene. Steve.
So first, thanks for bringing out this midrash. I think it's amazing. I was thinking about this patrilineal lineage, and of course, in the other section of Ruth that you just read to us, they describe the patrilineal lineage, the patr yes,
Yeah,
patrimony.
patrilineal.
Okay, but I'm also fascinated by this dialogue, and I the fact that the response to your people or my people are the obligations and punishments, I'll call it the negative covenants, uh, sort
Yeah, or
of
the
is
negative mitzvot, I think is what might
negative
be.
mitzvot.
It's
Yeah,
all about
yeah,
the thou
negative.
shalt nots.
Yeah, the negative mitzvot sort of suggests, but it goes beyond the negative mitzvot because uh, it doesn't refer to mitzvot there, I don't think, right? I mean, it's
It doesn't. No,
the
the text doesn't say. I'll
yeah,
tell you what it says. It says, let's take a peek. Um, so the Hebrew here is Amrala biti ein darkan shel Yisrael lador babayit she'ein sham mezuzah. Okay, so that's the thing about the
yeah,
mezuzah. That's the word. Okay.
yeah,
Amrala ba'asher talini alin. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge.
Lodge.
Amechami, your people will be my people.
Might be.
Elu anashim ve'azharot. So my translation here, Elu, these are the anashim means penalties or punishments, or actually it's
Nashim.
onashim. The Hebrew word for punishment word
Va'azeha
is onesh.
rot.
And azharot means warnings or things you're not supposed. I mean, it means cautions or things you're not
yeah.
supposed to do.
So my reaction is those are things that have essentially been created by the rabbis.
Totally.
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 And it's the people and that the mitzvot are ascribed to God. Uh,
Hmm. Oh, nice. You're
a
looking at it
very
as
interesting
like
the
God's
negative and the
rules
positive.
versus our rules.
Right. So that to reinforce Shai Held's thought that God is love.
Hmm. Beautiful. And somebody commented that the actress is Peggy Wood. And apparently there's also a song cycle about Ruth. Thanks for the chat in the chat window. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so looking now uh, at not no more on this midrash. There's a lot. The Ruth Rabbah is a great text, by the way. It's a really fun midrash. But I wanna do what we are really primarily convened to do, which is look at Talmud. So I'm gonna try and keep this as organized as I can because there's a lot bundled into like 2 pages of Talmud, Yevamot 47a and b, that comments on conversion, but some of it is repetitive and some of it goes down some rabbit holes that might distract us from the main ideas. So I'm going to do my best to help us navigate, starting at Tractate Yevamot, page 47a. So Yivamot is interesting. It's a great word. Yibum, which is the singular noun from which Yivamot, the plural, is taken. Yibum is the condition of levirate marriage, or the Yibum is the levir, Levir, and Yivamot means levirate marriage. So, in order to understand this, you need to know what levirate marriage is. It is a norm or a practice in biblical Judaism that is picked up and elaborated by the rabbis, but under the proviso that it doesn't really exist in rabbinic Judaism. So, it's one of those norms of Jewish life that is visible almost like in silhouette or in absence because it is part of the Jewish tradition, but it is explicit in the Jewish tradition that we don't actually do this anymore. But because it is a biblical norm, the rabbis seek to explain it, and I guess my words would be they spiritually authorize it, but they don't authorize it as an actual practice for the Jewish people. So they come up with a halachic workaround for actually practicing levirate marriage. So what is levirate marriage? Levirate marriage is the condition where a woman and a man are married and the man dies, and the brother of the now dead husband is obligated by Israelite law to marry the widow. That's levirate marriage. And so the brother who is obligated is known as the levir. This was intended to secure an inheritance for the dead husband. And as such, any offspring who would be born to the widow, now remarried to the levir, the brother of the deceased, the offspring are still considered to be the offspring of the dead husband, right? So they are not claimed, at least for the purpose of inheritance, they are not, as it were, the levir's offspring. He is siring children in the name of his dead brother, who apparently had, you know, a primary place in perpetuating that family line. So presumably it's well, I don't know actually. I think I'd be overstating the case to say it's the older it's that the dead husband is the older, because it could come about that it was actually the younger brother who died and the older one still living now has to take the wife as the levir. There is a condition that is provided where the levir can waive his responsibility to marry, and it involves doffing his shoe and performing an act called chalitza, which means to doff one shoe. And it's actually I believe it's in the book of Ruth. It's been a while. I didn't prepare this part of the lesson today, so I'm like dredging up. So obviously, as a Reform rabbi, I don't preside over many cases of levirate marriage. Like I've never done that. But in the Orthodox world, this is still done. So in the Orthodox world, levirate marriage is not permitted, but chalitza, the act of doffing the shoe and making a declaration that I waive my responsibility of marrying my dead brother's widow, is practiced. So in the ultra-Orthodox world, if this condition eventuates, the brother of the dead guy does have to perform chalitza. He has to take off his shoe and make some declaration that says, "I am obligated to marry this woman, but I am released of my obligation." That's the sum of it. So that's why I mean it's sort of like you're looking at the shadow of levirate marriage because it is not practiced, but it is considered to be a legitimate practice. Michelle.
In Ruth, Boaz does something like this. He is a family member. He is not the brother.
He's not the levir, right?
He's not the brother, but he does a ceremony, or somebody, not he doesn't, but somebody else who is a cousin
Yeah.
does that. So it's implied, but it does not strictly follow it. So it's
Thank you. Yeah, I knew there was something about it in the book, and again, it's not the part of the book that particularly interests me today. Tomorrow it might. Okay. Anyway, uh, so the section of the Talmud that takes up conversion is Yevamot. There's a whole tractate of the Talmud. I've actually have my print copy in front of me today. Oh, you can even see, look at the illustration they have. I didn't even notice this. This is the cover illustration for Yevamot, right? And so it's showing, all right, so I don't even know who's supposed to be who here, but clearly it's a stick figure representation of levirate marriage. And this little X means this guy got dead. Okay, I'll have to figure out what this illustration exactly means, but I think this is what we're talking about. And now, yeah, now this guy has two wives, his original wife, and he took up the responsibility to marry his dead brother's wife, the widow. That's her. That's the widow. That's the dead brother. That's the Levir, this guy here, that's the Levir's wife. And now here, the Levir has two wives, his dead brother's widow and his original wife. I'm pretty sure that's what I'm looking at. And that's not bad because I'm doing it backwards in front of you. Um, Okay, so anyway, I'm looking at Tractate Yevamot because of the place of levirate marriage in the Ruth story. That's why we have a Ruth discussion. But again, it is the way of the Talmud to kind of bundle stuff where it sees fit in this discursive, not necessarily, linear logical way for us to understand. So if you want to know, well, where do I find conversion in the Talmud? There is no tractate on conversion. You got to go to Yevamot and read about Ruth. Audrey. Unmute.
Yeah. I have just learned this about a year ago, but apparently that case of the brother marrying the other ones, well, they were engaged. Apparently my mother's parents, that was the case.
Oh, well.
Well,
Okay.
I can't ask my mother anymore, but
No.
apparently, and nobody ever told me this, but my mother kept a lot of secrets or tried to.
Fast.
But apparently her would have been uncle was engaged to my grandmother, and he died during World War I of diphtheria, not from the war, but he had diphtheria and he died. And my grandfather married my grandmother.
Wow.
Yeah, so
We
I mean,
know, we know, did he do it out of a sense of levirate obligation or just because he fell in love?
I am not sure. My cousin who told me, and then my sister said it was the Jewish tradition, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that they didn't fall in love.
Wow. Fascinating.
I have a messed up family.
Well, look, we all do.
I know
And
both sides. First cousins married.
yeah, somebody said to me recently, family is the other F word. Okay. Uh, let's let's go on. All right, so we have now in front of us a little bit of Gemara, a little bit of Talmud from Yevamot, chapter 47. I'm going to bring the passage on screen, and we're going to do some reading. So Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, and again, this is a giveaway phraseology that indicates we're looking at a Baraita, a Mishnaic passage, or Mishnaic era passage, not in the Mishnah, but contemporaneous with the Mishnah. Ger sheba lehitgayer bizman hazeh. A ger. So now the rabbis are fully comfortable using this word ger, and in this context, as opposed to the Tanakh, as opposed to the Bible, ger means the convert. So it's clear that although conversion is not a biblical norm, in the rabbinic world, in the rabbinic mindset, in the rabbinic literature, there is a thing called conversion. And again, I think the rabbis in the Midrash were that we just looked at were kind of looking at Naomi as their archetype. I find it very amusing that when Ruth said, "I really want to convert," Naomi, I can imagine her going, "Oh, we don't really have that. So here are a bunch of rules. Like I'm gonna make up." They said she had to make up the rules or fix the rules of conversion. That was the first thing she had to do. It's like, oh, nobody's ever asked to do that before. Well, the rabbis probably see a little bit of themselves in Naomi, or they write themselves into the character of Naomi in that previous midrash. For the rabbis, though, there is such a thing as conversion, and that's because they say so. And we could probably speculate as to the sociological factors that led the rabbis to part company with the biblical norm of there is no such thing as conversion. You're either in the community or not, but you don't. Because remember, for the rabbis, Judaism isn't a religion. It's a way of life. It's a people that have certain folk ways, but it's not a set of strictly regimented beliefs the way we often like the first thing that comes to mind if somebody says define what a religion is. Jews are not a religion. Judaism is not a religion. I call it a religious civilization or a spiritual civilization. That's my favorite way of talking about Judaism. When I'm not being metaphorical and strictly metaphorical, in which case I say, what is Judaism? Judaism is a conversation. I believe that. That's Larry Hoffman. Attribute that one to him. I really think it's the best definition of Judaism in 3 words, 4 words. Okay. ger sheba lehitgayer bizman hazeh. When a convert presents himself for conversion, ger sheba lehitgayer, so literally a convert who comes to convert, bizman hazeh, this you should know, even just from the Hanukkah blessings, bizman hazeh means at this time. Bizman hazeh, meaning currently, here's the practice. Omrim lo, we say to him, or they say to him, Ma rayita shebata lehitgayer. Like, what is it? What did you observe that brought you to convert? What have you seen that made you come to convert? This is fascinating. It's like, what do you know about us? What have you seen about the Jews and the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition that makes you want to do this? I ata yodea sheYisrael bizman hazeh divuyim. Don't you know, I ata yodea, don't you know that Israel, meaning the Jewish people, bizman hazeh, at this time, divuyim, are in pain, it's terrible, it's torment to be a Jew. Dichufim, we are oppressed. Suchufim, we are hated. Umitorafin, and we are literally torn up. This is a great word, mitorafin. I don't know if you can see the the letters I'm highlighting here are tet vav resh pe, toraf. That's the root of the word treif. Treif literally means torn. Like the word treif, which we mean by when we use the word treif, we mean any food that's not kosher. But literally in the Torah, it says, don't eat any animals that are torn apart by wild dogs, right? Don't eat any meat that where it's the case of like a predator animal tore up the animal limb from limb. That's not how we eat meat. So mitorafin, literally, we are treifified. We are torn to bits. We are violently physically attacked. I mean, this might resonate with New Force post October 7th. Why would you want this? We're supposed to ask the would-be convert. Don't you know how lousy it is to be a Jew? Visurin bayin alehem. And finally, all of these afflictions come unto them, meaning anyone who chooses to be part, or anyone who is part of the Jewish people, it's a life of suffering. Im Omer, if he says, Yodea ani, I know, ve'eni kedai, and yet still I am unworthy of joining you, which is, you might call it false humility, but the point is like, I know, and still nothing would make me happier than to be a Jew. It goes on to say, Mikablino tomiyad. In that case, we accept him immediately. All right, so a person says, I want to convert. The proper response, and usually this is a responsibility assigned to the Beit Din, the rabbinical court. In Jewish practice, 3 duly ordained rabbis. You put them together, they constitute a Beit Din or a rabbinical court. Sorry, something in my eye. They are tasked with responding to the convert by proposing a kind of test of sincerity, beginning with a very, very stern warning. Hey, what do you know about being Jewish? And before the guy can even get a word in edgewise, it's because it's really bad. Like is not a happy thing to be a Jew. You get spat on and people don't like you and everyone's an anti-Semite and literally we are physically attacked. Why would you want this? And if the guy says, "No, I know all that," but still, even though I'm not worthy, the what's implied here is it is my sincere desire. And if at that point the person can say, I know, and yet I choose, then he is accepted immediately. Alan.
Is this a stem from the tradition of dissuading someone to convert 3 times?
Instead of stem from, I would say is the root of. So the custom that is still practiced in much of the Jewish world is that a person who presents himself or herself for conversion should be turned away 3 times as a test of sincerity. When I was ordained in June of 2000, just a couple weeks later, I attended my first conference as a newly ordained rabbi of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the CCAR, which is the organizing body of Reform rabbis, the rabbinical arm of our movement. I'm now on the board of the CCAR. The CCAR holds a convention every year, and this year it was lovely because it was it was like in Big Sur. It was really nice. And the Reform movement actually passed a resolution at the big plenary session that year. So this is 24 years ago, 24 and a half years ago. Our movement officially signed or passed a resolution declaring that we Reform rabbis would not preemptively turn away a person who presented oneself for conversion. So the Reform movement broke with that custom, saying, hey, we Jewish people need all the help we can get these days. And the last thing we want to do is take somebody who says, I want to be a Jew, and say, no, you don't. Here's the door. So rather than showing them the door, we are invited to accept them with open arms. And in fact, there's an interesting dialogue I've been in with some of my colleagues that if a person comes to a rabbi in the Reform movement with the desire to convert, but our movement says, the ethics of the CCAR, our code says, you may not charge them, which is really interesting, which I think is an important principle as well. So often the people who want to convert are our members of WRT. That there it's not an issue. In fact, I'm working right now with a member of the congregation who's belonged for decades and has lived a functionally Jewish life, and who recently said to me just this past summer, hey, not even summer, I think it was right after the holidays, I think I want to be a Jew. I'm like, yeah, of course you do. Like you've been living it, you're in your 60s. You've been living a Jewish life for the last 30 years since you married a Jew and raised 3 Jewish kids. Um, but sometimes we've been approached by 3 convert candidates off the streets in the last few months, and we don't push them away and we don't charge them. Sometimes we say, you need to take a class. We're not offering that class. You have to take it online or go into the city. But usually we will supervise people for conversion whether or not they affiliate at WRT because it's a mitzvah, right? It's in the category of we see it as our rabbinical responsibility to help bring people closer to the Jewish tradition. And that is not a privilege for which you should be charged money. So thanks, Alan. Is anyone on the line today brave enough to disclose the fact that you are a convert to Judaism? I'm looking around and I'm not sure we have any today. We have had others participate. I mentioned last week Rob Resco, but Rob got a new job, which is wonderful. He's happy about it. Maybe Rob will tell his story. Rob converted under my supervision and, of course, with a Beit Din around this time last year, November of 2023. And it's just one of the nicest things I get to do. Okay, so back to the text. Let's zoom. All right, here we go. Tanu Rabbanan, Ger sheba lehitgayer bizman hazeh. Okay, so this is what we say to him. Then the court accepts him immediately. In other words, as Steinsaltz adds in the gloss, to begin the conversion process. So when they and Steinsaltz is giving that so that you don't misread the meaning of the text, which is we don't accept him as a Jew immediately. We accept him as a conversion candidate, right? Judaism conversion is a process. It is not an overnight thing. Okay, and so what happens next? Once you've determined that no, even though it's hard being a Jew, the person is doing this with open eyes and is aware that being a Jew is not like a walk in the park. At that point, we accept him as a candidate for conversion. And the next step, according to the Talmud, is as follows. Umodi'in oto mikzat mitzvot kalot umitzat mitzvot chamurot. So modi'in oto, which means we advise him or we inform him, we make him aware. From yodea is the same root. So we make known to him mikzat, which means a bit, a little bit. Mitzvot kalot, a little bit of the simple mitzvot, the light mitzvot, mikzat mitzvot chamurot, and the heavy mitzvot, the big ones, the serious ones. Which is very interesting because it doesn't say what exactly those are. And the fact that the rabbis have these categories, some of the mitzvot are light, I guess I don't know which ones those are. Not mixing linen and wool, shatnez. I don't know. And also the serious ones: don't murder, don't commit adultery. Umodi'ino to avon leket shicha. And so we also inform him, look what's next. And just the order of events is fascinating here. We inform him about the sin of the forgotten sheaf, right? This is the regulation that if uh, produce, grain, and corn that is not on the stalk at the time you are reaping your harvest, but has already fallen to the ground, you are prohibited from collecting, but rather have to leave on the ground for the poor to come and take under the cover of night so as to protect not only their lives, but their dignity. So we inform him of that particular mitzvah, the mitzvah of the fallen sheaf, the forgotten sheaf. Upea umasar oni, as well as the mitzvah that allows the poor to glean from the fields. Any guesses as to why these? It's like, so we teach him a smattering of mitzvahs, and then we get into the forgotten sheaf and leaving the corners of the field unharvested so that the poor can take their fill. Any conjectures as to why those? Why didn't we start with kashrut or Shabbos or circumcision or study Torah or praying 3 times a day or offering sacrifice? I mean, why the forgotten sheaf and the mitzvah of the gleanings? There's no one right answer here. I'm curious what you think. Mom and Dad, and then Russell.
I think it's to show that the most essential part of joining the Hebrews is compassion.
Okay, so there's a case. I think that's your Shai Held speaking, right? Shai would say, Rav Shai would say, this is yet another text of countless texts that show that chesed, loving kindness, and compassion, particularly for people who have less and need more, or even for people who aren't of your tribe, is not like an invitation in Judaism. It is an obligation, and it is perhaps central. Russell.
In addition, these are public facing
Say
acts.
more.
They are not, kashrut is done in private. There's nothing more private than circumcision. But these are not only being part of your activity as part of a community, as part of society, but also facing out to the larger society.
Beautiful. Love that. Steve.
I agree with both of those, and but also, and what Russell just said, it's about something for the community as a whole. It's really joining the community. This is for the community.
Thank you. Although it is not said, because I know what's coming up in the Talmud, I have wondered if it is intentional that these are the mitzvot which are referenced first. What's coming up in the Talmud is we're going to get back to our favorite character, Ruth. And the mitzvah at the heart of the Ruth story is all about gleaning from the fields. When Ruth comes to Judah with her mother-in-law, the widow Naomi, and Ruth herself is a widow, and has said, kind of sight unseen, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Wherever you die, I will be buried, etc., and so forth. Ruth is destitute. She has nothing, and she is sent out to glean in the fields alongside the other women who are gleaning. And often, if you see images of Ruth in artwork, it is especially Ruth the gleaner. Ruth, who, again, she's lost so much, but she hasn't lost her dignity. But she is destitute and she has to feed herself. So she goes out in the field, and that's where Boaz finds her. Right? So there is something I wonder, again, I don't have evidence that I wonder if the rabbis are almost foreshadowing the the image of the convert being associated with this particular mitzvah as a kind of nod to the place that the book of Ruth holds in the imagination of the rabbis. Again, specifically with respect to the mitzvah or to the regulations pertaining to conversion. So reading on a bit further now. Thank you for your insights. Again, I didn't. None of this is definitive. It seems unusual that of all the mitzvot we could pick from, that's the one the rabbis say is paramount. Audrey?
couldn't this also be something to welcome the convert
I think so.
into the
Yeah,
to
I
make
think
them
so.
to preserve their dignity and make them feel whole and welcomed?
Beautiful. Beautiful. I love all of these speculations about why this in this text. Okay. So, and then once you've advised about these particular mitzvot, it says, umodi'ino to onshan shel mitzvot. In addition to telling them about the obligations, the mitzvot, you also have to tell them about the penalties for failure to observe or wrong observance. Omrim lo, they say to him, again, presumably the Beit Din, though no subject is given, it's just predicate object. Omrim lo, they say to him, or we say to him. Heve yodea she'ad shelo bata limida zo. So we say, um, you should know, heve yodea, she'ad shelo bata lemidazo, that even had you not come to this station, or this, literally the word midah means measure, meaning this decision to convert. So even if you had not arrived at this place of readiness to convert, achalta chelev, if you ate the forbidden fat of an animal, iata anush karet. So it says you would not previously have been punished for eating a forbidden part of the animal. All right, that's what he's saying. Had you not decided this and you had done something wrong, there's no punishment for it. Uh, Chilalta Shabbat. If before this moment you have desecrated the Sabbath, iata skila. You are not culpable for punishment by stoning. Right? They're really relying on the biblical norms, even though there's no evidence that the rabbis stoned to death people who violated the Sabbath. It's like when we were learning to drive, they show you very scary videos. Like this is a serious responsibility, boys and girls. You could end up looking like this twisted heap of metal, blood, and bones. Okay, I remember that, by the way. It's like, I don't know if they still do that for the kiddos today, but I'm sure most of you remember Driver's Ed, where the videos are the worst. The mangled bodies on the side of the road. And then they're like, okay, here are the keys. All right. So, anyway, it's the same idea, right? If previous to this place in your life, this moment in your life, you had violated the Sabbath, you would not be culpable. You would not be subject to the punishment of stoning. Ve'achshav, but now, that's the Hebrew word, achal tachelev, if you eat forbidden fat, anush karet, you can be cut off from the community. You can be excommunicated. Chilalta Shabbat, and if you violate the Sabbath, if you desecrate Shabbat, anush skila, you could be stoned to death for that. So, again, lots of opportunities to say, oh, I didn't realize this Judaism thing is not a lightweight tradition. Maybe I don't want to be part of it. So it seems like opportunities to take a graceful bow out are provided at regular intervals here. No, that's not Arlene's hand. That's just a yellow lamp above your head that looks like a hand. Audrey, you have a comment, please. And
Yes, I'm wondering, are male, or even at that time, were male versus female potential converts treated differently?
I don't think so. Though it's interesting. Again, the overriding language of the Talmud is framed in the masculine, as it is here. But because we're going to get to the part where Ruth becomes the paradigm of the convert, it would be hard to argue that this does not apply equally to women. Right? If Ruth is your role model,
Right.
it stands to reason. Steve.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding the period at which once you've made this choice, you now have to you can be punished. Is that during the process of conversion
Hard to
or
say. This
upon
is
conversion?
hard
Because
to say.
it's like it's suddenly you're going forward. It reminds me that I mean I don't know whether it's technically part of it, but it's frequently part of it that someone who's converts takes on a new name,
It's a really
right?
good question. Um, I don't have an answer. I'm looking at some of the commentary in my printed edition. I don't have an answer just at the ready. What I would speculate is that, again, it's another opportunity to say, before we go any further in your education, You need to know this, but it says, had you not arrived or before you arrived at this midah, again, this measure, which is an interesting word because I don't really know the best way to render it in English. So before you arrived at this midah, you would not have been held accountable for these punishments. Now that you, again, now that you are here, you are culpable. Um, Hard to say.
See, it seems to me
Again,
that
I
there,
think it could go either way. It could be at the discretion of the court, the Beit Din. When I am working with a convert, again, as a reform rabbi, I believe in informed autonomous choice, and I don't speak in the language of obligation and punishment so much as I speak in the language of invitation and experimentation as a way into Jewish life. And that's what I believe Jewish life is. It's an invitation to participate as meaningfully as one can, and that's not the same for everyone, or it's not the same for any
yeah.
two people. Um, but I do say I want you to try this on and not approach it from a remove. Don't Your conversion process is not like touring a museum gallery where you're not supposed to touch. You have to actually try these things. So when we get to our discussion with every convert candidate about dietary practice, and I do that with I'm like, I want you to try this. Like at a minimum, fast on Yom Kippur,
Yeah.
observe the Pesach Pass restrictions. And I think that every convert to Judaism should try a month of kosher. A month. It
Yes.
doesn't have to be too strict, but I want people to try before they buy.
Yeah, so it just felt like if conversion in the context of the rabbis is a process, that you have to be aware of a an obligation before you can be held responsible for it. And in some respects, these two are being you're finding out immediately, just like the Midrash picked on two specific things early on to make you know that those were critical.
That's right.
So
Yeah. Arlene and then Anne, please.
So, Jonathan, in today's current Reform Judaism, is patrilineal descent accepted for Judaism as a practice?
Yeah, and we can get to this at some other point if you want to go even
Okay.
deeper. But for the last 41 years, the Reform movement has officially endorsed patrilineal descent as a pathway to legitimate acceptance in the Jewish community. However, a couple of provisos. One, it is only American Reform Judaism. Even the Reform movement in Canada does not accept patrilineal descent. This is
Ah,
fascinating.
it
And
is.
and the Reform movement in Israel, to my knowledge, doesn't either. So only the American Reform movement, which is one place in which the decision that was rendered when Alexander Schindler was the president of the URJ, and he was, I think, influential because it really emerged out of his um, outreach campaign. Outreach became the byword of the reform movement under Schindler. Um, the So the practice of patrilineal descent was adopted to quite some controversy in 1983. It states that a Jew can, or a the child of a Jewish father or Jewish mother or father can be accepted fully as Jewish in a reform context if the child is raised with identifiable Jewish acts. So,
Okay.
so in other words, it actually isn't just about patrilineal descent. For me, the greater force, the greater part of the resolution shifts Jewish status from a matter of birthright to a matter of practice and observance, which, by the way, I both admire and find highly problematic. By and large, I think that the reform movement and the Jewish people as a whole have benefited greatly from the patrilineal standard being applied in the reform movement. I think that our communities and this community would be somewhat or considerably impoverished were we to disbar people who have one Jewish parent who is the father, but a non-Jewish mother from automatic or I shouldn't, it's not automatic, from being accepted, or where the assumption is that person should be accepted into the community. But again, it's provisional because the resolution actually says so long as the parents raise the child Jewishly. So it is not enough that the patrilineal standard is held. It is also required that both parents participate in
Right.
the kid a Jewish name and sending the kid to religious school. And the problem with that, of course, is that it's therefore applied selectively. I mean, it should apply to both kids of Jewish mothers and kids of Jewish fathers,
Right.
and where both parents are Jewish.
Right.
If it
Okay.
makes, so it makes Judaism much less about an automatic, status that is conferred upon a child, and much more about the parental obligation to raise the child identifiably Jewish.
By the way, do we know if any other religion requires this kind of background?
I do not know.
Okay, that's interesting.
It's a really interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I started to talk about this last time. This is about conversion, but entirely different from what we're talking about now. When I lived in Israel for a year in the 60s, I was hanging out with Sephardic Jews part of the time.
Mhm.
And I knew a woman from Algeria. Remember Algeria? She had to leave Algeria because she owed money to people and she didn't want to pay them or couldn't pay them. So she married a Jew and she wanted to go to Israel and she became Jewish. She did the whole bit, the
Mhm.
mikveh and everything, and became Jewish. However, I'm not sure I would consider her Jewish because she came to Israel and my friend and I were walking over to their house and they were having a fight. And she said to her husband, she says, I hate you and your whole dirty race. Now, is she Jewish?
I'm relieved that I don't have to actually render a decision on that. It's a very sad story. And I'm not convinced that a comment like that is dispositive of a whole lot other than the things that people say when they're in a terrible argument.
Yeah.
But it's sad, right? You do, of course, we know cases where it turns out after a person is duly converted that, their sincerity appears to be somewhat weak or suspect when, for instance, a divorce. So a person converts in the context of marrying somebody. I'm not going to say for that other person, though they might, in the context of marriage. And then when the marriage dissolves, the person goes back to living a non-Jewish life. Alan Markowitz actually asked me about this last week on an offline conversation. And from the Jewish perspective, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and you can never un-Jew yourself, even a convert. So the status of Jewish is permanent, whether you come to it by birth or by conversion. However, you can become an apostate Jew. The term in Hebrew is Yisrael Mumar, which means basically a Jew who is outside the community by dint of non-observance or rejection of Jewish practice, but you're still a Jew. So case in point, I feel this very personally because I'm married to a woman who converted to Judaism. By the way, long before we were married, before I was a rabbi, before we were engaged. Like, so people sometimes they misread the name Kelly Kathleen McCormick and assume a lot of things. We just tell people it's Sephardic. I think I mentioned that last week. So, but if Kelly, who became Jewish and went to the mikveh with Orthodox supervision, there are some other issues because her Beit Din was reform. So there are still people who would not accept Kelly's conversion. Nonetheless, let's just say we accept Kelly's conversion. But Kelly decides at some point, I'm done with you and your whole dirty race. Sorry, I shouldn't say. No, I'm done with this. I'm leaving forever. I'm going to become what I was when I grew up, which is Presbyterian. This would not happen. I know. But if that were the case, from the standpoint of the church, she would be accepted straight away as a Presbyterian. From the standpoint of Judaism, she's still a Jew. And if she wanted to come back to Judaism, she would not have to reconvert. She doesn't have to go back into the mikveh. She doesn't have to like atone in a public way. She makes tshuva. She would say, "I'm returning to Judaism," and she'd be accepted as Jewish. So, as I said to Alan in my email, Judaism is like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Okay.
But also, she didn't become Jewish because she wanted to. I don't think she became Jewish because she wanted to become Jewish. She was wanted to go to Israel to get away from the people she owed money to.
I'm glad you qualified that we're talking about the Algerian woman and not Kelly. Yes. I mean, again,
wasn't talking about Kelly. I was talking
no,
about
I know. I know. Yes. Okay. So again, I'm glad it wasn't up to me to be in charge of the sincerity of that person. Look, you can't win them all. People sometimes ask me, "Well, hey Blake, do you feel bad if a couple that you married gets divorced?" I'm like, "Yeah, I feel bad because divorce is sad, but I don't feel responsible. It's not up to me." Like, and what do I know? What does anyone know when they get married? They're 28 when I stand under the chuppah. They get divorced at 35. I had nothing to do with that. And I mean, like, I did what I could. But like, I don't think it's a failure of the rabbi who married them. All right. And sometimes, by the way, couples that I'm sure are going to get divorced are going strong after 35 years. And sometimes couples I think are the greatest thing since sliced bread get divorced after 5 years. So what do I know? Okay. Let's take a few comments and we're going to look at the remaining passage. Mom and Dad, next, please.
I wanted to recommend to Anne the literary works of Shalom Auslander, who was raised in an Orthodox family in Monsey and has found that his religious upbringing has just been a curse to him his entire life. And he's written two books. The first one was called Foreskin's Lament, and the other one, which just came out, is called Feh, F-E-H.
Yeah, he's written three books actually. His first book was called Beware of God.
Oh, okay. Well, was that the same subtitle of Foreskin's Lament?
Different.
Different
Beware
book.
of God, Foreskin's Lament, and Feh are his three big books. And he's written a bunch of short.
So I highly recommend that as to somebody who has been mortally wounded and conflicted his entire life over Orthodox, his Orthodox upbringing, but has still not, given it up or, he may denounce it and may denounce God, but he's still, quite a Jew.
Hotel California, baby.
There you go.
Even Jay. Oh, unmute kindly.
Without going into all the gory details of my complicated family, my stepmother was converted out as a child in Austria in the late 20s and raised her children, my stepsisters, at Riverside Church. She was married to a Jew, and her parent, my stepmother's parents, were Jewish. When my nephew, her grandson, who's married to a Jew, wanted to convert, the rabbi said that it wasn't really necessary for him to convert because just what you're saying, Rabbi, that he was a Jew. His grandmother was born a Jew, and therefore he is a Jew, although she recommended that he does convert just to mark that change from living a life as a Reformed Christian in the United Church of Christ to being a Jew. And when he went to the mikveh, he did the whole 9 yards and lived became the most observantly Jewish person in the family for a period of time. Not anymore, but so it's exactly as you describe, even, now in our day and time.
Well, often, by the way, I mean, often, Anne's story notwithstanding, because there always has to be an exception that proves every rule. Often, in my experience of Jewish community life, those who choose Judaism, those who convert to Judaism, really reside among the most dedicated to the tradition and the people. Okay? And that there's a logic to that, right? Because they chose it. Okay, Arlene, and then I'll do a little bit more text, and then we'll end.
My understanding was that during the time of the Nazis, even if you had one Jewish grandparent, you were a Jew. That was it.
Right. The Nazis, of course, there's no need to apply a halachic standard because the Nazis' theory of Judaism was, I mean, again, hearkening back to Anne's quotation, which is a very vulgar and ugly thing to have said, that for the Nazis, Judaism was a race. So it was much more akin to the racial standards that by which a person was designated black under American slavery and Jim Crow, right? So even a little droplet of it was enough to contaminate you. So it had nothing to do with halachic standards or your level of practice or affiliation. If Judaism, as the Nazis contended, is a race and not a religion, there was nothing you could do. You could never get rid of it. And even the smallest fraction, by which the Nazi standard was 1/8 Jewish, one grandparent, then you were subjected to, to death. Which, by the way, interestingly, is the same standard that the state of Israel applied and applies in its law of return. Aha. So the legal standard for repatriating Israel, the Jewish state, as a Jew is intentionally an appropriation of the Nazi standard of the death sentence for people who were racially contaminated as Jews. Okay. So I want to just kind of like breeze through how the Talmud takes this. Oh, by the way, there's a counterpoint to this. So it says, just as they inform him about the punishment for transgressing the mitzvot, they also inform him about the reward granted for fulfilling them. So, by the way, it's not all bad. They say to him, be aware that the world to come, those of you who've been studying with me for a long time may be familiar with this term. I'm not going to unpack it in detail here, but it's all on the YouTube, is made only for the righteous. And if you observe the mitzvot, you will merit it. And also be aware that the Jewish people at the present time are unable to receive their full reward in this world because we're living in a pre-messianic era where the righteous suffer and the good and the evil prosper. They are not able to receive either an abundance of good nor an abundance of calamity. So the Jews are kind of in a real-life limbo since the primary place for reward and punishment is in Olam Haba, the world to come. And they, meaning the Beit Din, do not overwhelm him with threats, and they are not exacting with him about the details of the mitzvah. In other words, if a person's just coming to you and you've just sussed out that the person is sincere in the desire to convert, don't give them all sorts of reasons to second guess their decision, right? Don't bludgeon them with, oh, and by the way, 6 hours after you eat meat and with milk and separate dishes, we'll get to that. We'll get to, but for now, how wonderful, you want to join us. Yeah, you should be aware you can't violate the Sabbath. But, for the most part, we're happy to have you. Now, Kibel, if he accepts, Malino Tomiyad, which is fascinating. This is not the standard of conversion they use today. They're like, okay, let's go to the moil. I told you there'd be a moil in today's class. Nishtayerubot tzitzin, and if there still remain on him shreds of flesh, in other words, if the circumcision was a little bit wiggly, go back and do it again. Okay, I'm not going to get into this. And for women, they talk about take her straight to the mikveh. So by the way, whoever asked about, is this equally applicable to women? There it is. I had forgotten that it's right there just because I wanted to skip over this paragraph, but not worth skipping over. And again, for women too, where there is no circumcision, the thing you do for a woman is you immerse her in the mikveh, which is also required for males who convert. What I wanted to show you, because there are all of these conditions. What about an emancipated slave? What about a woman who's menstruating and you're not supposed to, go into the mikveh if you're menstruating? Okay. Forgotten sheaves again. So here's where things are interesting. So we get back to, they inform him of the sin of neglecting the mitzvah to allow the poor to take gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and produce in the corner of one's field. And they do not overwhelm him with threats, and they are not exacting with him about the details of the mitzvah. All of this is just a recap. We've already learned that. Then Rabbi Elazar said, what is the verse from which this ruling is derived? So this is very interesting. We're really deep into a conversation about conversion. I mean, we're already talking about circumcision, maybe more than once, to get rid of all of the flesh dangles from the foreskin, and immersion for women, and all of these other conditions. What if it's an emancipated slave? What if the woman is menstruating? And then Rabbi Elazar says, wait a minute, where do we get this? What's the biblical source for this practice? And the one that is brought is indeed from the first chapter of Ruth, as is written. And when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, she left off speaking with her. As Steinsaltz glosses, when Naomi set out to return to Eretz Yisrael, Ruth insisted on joining her. The Gemara understands this to mean that Ruth wished to convert, as we have said. Naomi attempted to dissuade her, but Ruth persisted. See, that's how they're reading this norm of dissuasion before persuasion. The verse states that once Naomi saw Ruth's resolve to convert, she desisted from her attempts to dissuade her. The Gemara infers from here that the same approach should be taken by a court in all cases of conversion. And then it gets into this beautiful Agadah, a homiletical midrash, folklore, which is not the dominant way in which the Talmud speaks, but the Talmud is punctuated with Aggadic midrash throughout. Amrala, she said to her, Asir lan tachum Shabbat. He says, so again, the Talmud is now reconstructing, as they say here, the original dialogue. The Talmud is playing midrashically with the text of the Ruth story. Well, what did Naomi actually tell her? They say, Asir lan tachum Shabbat. She advised her about the prohibition of crossing the boundary on Shabbat. This is about the Eruv, right? Ba'asher teilchi elech. And what did Ruth say? She said, wherever you go, I will go. This is different. In the Midrash, remember what Naomi said? Not allowed to go to the theaters and the circuses of the Goyim. And Ruth says, hey, Naomi, wherever you go, I will go. In the Talmud, it's the same idea. It's a reconstructed or imagined dialogue that the rabbis superimpose on the text of the book of Ruth. In this case, Naomi says, by the way, on Shabbos, because of the Eruv, you can't cross the boundary. And Ruth says, no problem, mother-in-law. Ba'asher teilchi elech. Wherever you go, I will go. In other words, I'm going to toe the line. I'm not going to cross that Eruv if you don't. Asir lan yichud. Okay, so she said, you're not allowed to be alone with another unmarried man. Ba'asher talini alin. I'm not going to sleep anywhere you don't sleep. You see how again, it's midrash on these famous verses from Ruth. We all know that Ruth said, wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. And it goes on from here. Naomi said, we are commanded to observe 613 mitzvot. And Ruth said, your people will be my people. Again, I want you to pay attention. What do we mean when we talk about Jewish peoplehood? For the rabbis, it defaults to, we are commanded to observe the mitzvot. And then Naomi said, idolatrous worship is forbidden to us. And that's where Ruth gets the opportunity to chime in with her famous line, your God is my God. Naomi said 4 types of capital punishment were handed over to a court with which to punish those who transgress the mitzvot. And Ruth responded, I'm going to subject myself to the same death penalty that you do, which is a very interesting way of imaginatively rereading wherever you die, I will die. It's more like, howsoever you subject yourself to death, I will accept the same strictures and penalties. And then 2 burial grounds, Naomi instructs her, were handed over to the court, one for those executed for more severe crimes and another for those executed for less severe. In other words, I'm going to tell you everything about crime and punishment in the Jewish law. And Ruth is saying, yes, I consent to your laws about execution and burial. And it goes on and on and on from here. So the rabbis use the Ruth story in this incredibly imaginative, some would argue far-fetched way, to endorse the idea that to become a convert means that you accept all of the mitzvot with their stipulated penalties. Russell and Steve, and then we'll find a way to conclude our conversation for the day.
In a way, I kind of wish they hadn't written this second part. I thought the original statement is so beautiful and so loving and seems to come from her heart. And now she's sort of saying, look, I'll just follow you. Like I'll just do what you do. It almost turns it into a matter of rote, a matter of copycat, and not really coming from the heart. Am I reading too much into this?
No, I think you're reading it the way the rabbis want you to read it. The fact that you don't like it is not really their concern. I think the rabbis need to superimpose on this beautiful dialogue what they understand Judaism to be all about, which is about rules and following the rules. And there is a certain sense of rote acceptance being the desired outcome here. Whereas for me, as a Reform rabbi, what I really am after is that a convert can live an authentically Jewish life in a Reform context, which means they have to be aware of the tradition. They have to know what's inside the bounds and what's out of bounds. But for the most part, I want converts to live Jewish lives the way I live a Jewish life, which is as, a kind of ongoing mindfulness practice about what opportunities does my life offer me to express how to be Jewish? And the answer is, well, countless. And therefore, I have to make thoughtful decisions each and every day. So I'm more interested in training converts to develop Jewish eyes, right? A Jewish way of looking at the world, which is a far more broad and abstract and even poetic enterprise than the one that the rabbis are interested in inculcating here. So, the fact that you affiliate at this temple, Russell, probably bespeaks that you and I share a similar view of this.
So I think that's right, but I just wonder if you hand the menu to your mother-in-law and say, you order for me, are you real, to use your expression, are you really seeing the world through Jewish eyes?
It's beautiful. It's a great question. The question stands on its own as a question. Thank you. Steve.
I find that fascinating that in this retelling of that of essentially the Midrash, all 613 commandments are the response to your people are my people.
Yeah.
But isn't you shall worship no other God beside me, idolatrous worship, the first commandment?
Kind
So
of
it's
is.
like,
The second, yeah.
well, right.
Second, yeah.
Yeah. So I, but it's called out separately. So it's a very different rendition.
Correct.
And I didn't know whether you wanted to react to that.
No, I'm struck by the difference as well. And I'm also struck by the fact that only 3 paragraphs earlier, they say, well, we give them kind of like a smattering of mitzvot, but the one we want to emphasize is about the sheaves. And then again, only paragraphs later, we say, actually, it's this. And that's why I said I wanted to guide you through this passage, but I knew that I would have to be selective in the reading. If you read 47a and 47b in sequence top to bottom, which I do commend to you, just go on Safaria, you'll see that it probably is giving evidence of being what the Talmud in fact is, which is a multivocal work without rigorous internal consistency. Right. So clearly, although it is not attributed to different rabbis or different schools of thought, it appears as if the final rendering on the page offers us multiple ways of thinking about or of understanding how the conversion process actually developed and what was emphasized. For some, it was about here are a few mitzvot, but the basic thrust is welcome. For others, it's no, no, no. This is a rigorous unpacking of the Jewish tradition where what is expected from the convert is to sign on the dotted line and say, I'll do it. Again, I kind of favor the more abstract welcome to the Jewish tradition. There's no way I can teach you all 613 mitzvot. That's the project of a lifetime. And I think that's the other piece here. Because what conversion is in the Jewish tradition, it's not a faith declaration, right? It's a way of life. So you can't expect that a person is going to adopt all 613 mitzvot wholesale. Nobody has ever done that. Moses didn't do that. Rabbi Akiva didn't do that. So even the people who are most observant in the world kind of know that 613 is a poetic way of talking about the totality of this vast tradition. So you don't want to forestall a person's membership in the Jewish community until they are actually performing all the mitzvot. On the other hand, you don't want a person going into this blind. So it seems as if the Talmud is giving evidence of the fact that the rabbis are grappling with, well, how much or how little do we need to give the convert before we say, welcome aboard, this is yours, this tradition is yours as well.
Yeah, I wonder whether the the calling out of idolatrous worship is bound in time to sort of separating from its sister faith, Christianity.
Quite possibly. And remember, this wasn't an issue at the time of Ruth, but it was very much an issue at the time of the writing of the Talmud and the rabbis. So yeah, I usually assume that even the Talmud is loath to mention Jesus or Christianity explicitly. In fact, it almost never does. It does it in code. So when it talks about Jesus, it often talks about a sorcerer, and everybody kind of knows who this guy was. Even still, it caught the eye of censors, not as much during the Roman period, but very much during the 14th and 15th centuries. The church, the Catholic Church, used the Talmud as the kind of, uh, you know, first case evidence that the Jews were um, bent on the destruction of the Christian church and therefore public burnings of Talmuds and of Jews. But that's much later in the history of Christian Jewish relations. Okay, quick comments from Barbara and Russell, and then I'll say something else, and then we'll end.
Rabbi, I'm stuck on the beginning of the conversation, accepting Judaism. The word was chamor. Now, a chamor is a donkey.
Yeah, in this case, it's not a donkey.
It's not a donkey.
No, chamor in this case means heavy.
Oh, okay. Because
From
donkey,
chomer.
chamor, and stubborn, and
No, chamor
that
from the
connotation.
word, it's from chomer, which literally means the substance of the matter. So I would translate chamor in this case to be substantive, and the antipode, the opposite is, or the antilogue is the word kalot, mitzvot kalot, which means less substantive.
Yes.
Yeah, lighter mitzvot. Yeah.
It just seemed very strange to me. You have lighter, and then you have donkey. Okay,
Not
so
donkey.
it's not donkey.
False
Okay.
cognate. Yep, happy to clarify. Russell?
I apologize for being a blabbermouth, but I had actually wanted to cap off what we were discussing a few minutes ago, and that is my reading of the text that you just showed us does more than talk about conversion. I think it invites us to ask us about ourselves and our relationship with Judaism. And, is it really saying that we should be converting ourselves every day? As you say, no one is doing all 613 of these commandments. All of us in some fashion are a bit out. We're both inside and outside the tradition. And isn't this really inviting us on a regular and daily basis to effectively convert ourselves?
I love that, and it comports with the, I think, possibly creative, but no less necessary read of the tradition of calling the Jews the chosen people. More accurately, we should be understood as the choosing people. What it is to be a Jew is not to believe that you are the elect of God, but that you are already kind of like set up for the opportunity to choose a life of holiness and spiritual and moral nobility. For me, that is very much in line with the way you read this text, Russell, as an invitation. So I would that all Jews were, as the nice euphemism for a convert these days is a Jew by choice. Would that all of our people were Jews by choice.
Well, and it reminds me of the passage in Deuteronomy, which we read on the High Holy Days, which says, choose life if you wish to live. And that's not a single choice. That's not
right. In Moses' swan song to the Israelites, his final sermonic addresses to the community as framed in Deuteronomy, the theme of choice is like a crescendo to the very end of the Torah, where it's saying, okay, look at these 5 books we've given you. So much of this is now in your hands. How will you choose? Yeah, beautiful, Russell. Okay, Joe, unmute. I muted you for a moment. Yep.
in any discussion of the essence of being a Jew, I can now see why the mention of the sheets and or sheaves on the ground is probably one of the essence of being a Jew, is to consider someone other than yourself, the poor, the downtrodden, the hungry, the sick, and when you do that, you're actually fulfilling most of the other 613 mitzvot.
Beautiful. Rav Joe, everyone. I love that teaching. I think there's such a beautiful argument to be made for the centrality of the law of the sheaves in what it says about being a Jew. Okay, as we conclude, we've gone over and only for the sake of learning and blessing, which is lovely. Um, we have a couple weeks off. And then starting on January 9th, a 4-week mini mester. I'm very excited to welcome back our friend Rabbi Jan Katsu, who's my chavruta. He's my rabbinic study partner, my mentor and dear friend, retired professor of education of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He'll be zooming from his home in Cape Cod. He and our own full-time educator at the temple, Noam Vinakor Meinrat, are going to do a deep dive for 4 weeks into Israel's Declaration of Independence. And I really think it'll be an exciting and interesting text study. Then in February, Rabbi Alyssa Platkow, our newest member of the team, is going to do a text-oriented walkthrough of Jewish beliefs and practices around death, dying, and mourning. And this is an area of quite some expertise for her. She was recently named as one of Jewish Week's 36 to watch for her extraordinary work establishing the first non-Orthodox sacred burial society in the city of New York. So she knows a lot about this. She wrote her rabbinical thesis on it. So she's going to do 4 weeks. All of these, by the way, happen at 10:15. The link will be sent out because it won't come from my Zoom channel. So you have to register for different links. But I'll be sure to have Natalie send you the letters the way she does after every class to invite you to register for the class. And again, it's the same thing. Come one, come all, come some weeks, come every week, come 1 week. I think you'll enjoy it. And then once we get to March, Cantor Kleinman is going to do 4 weeks on getting ready for Pesach by studying the Passover Haggadah. So we have 3 classes that are going to be about Jewish text and Jewish life: the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, death, dying, and mourning, and getting ready for Pesach. And then right after Pesach, I'm with you all spring as we take a very deep dive into the remaining signposts on the Jewish life cycle, which will be marriage, divorce, and death. But we're going to look at death through a very different lens. We're going to, really look at it not only in terms of contemporary practice. We're going to really look at what does the Talmud say. So in the meantime, have a blessed and bright Hanukkah and a wonderful New Year and an early Shabbat Shalom. Take care.
Oh,
Shabbat shalom.
love you, John.
Love you too.
Shabbat Shalom.
Love you all. Bye-bye.